Steve, thank you for joining us. James, thank you for joining us. I think for me personally, as someone who grew up in Southeast London in almost the immediate aftermath of these events, it's a real privilege to be able to partake in this conversation today. I guess the first thing I wanted to sort of ask you both was, it strikes me that in many ways Uprising is almost a postscript to Small Axe and a precursor to Steve and the Murder That Changed the Nation. So given that, why did you both decide now was the time to make this film? And if I could ask you, Steve, to start off, please.
I wanted to tell this story. I think there are many people who want to tell this story. It's just one of those things where, I don't know, it's just for me, with making Small Axe, it took 11 years to get to this point. But at any time, obviously the story could have been told, but maybe people wouldn't have been willing to commission it. I'm not too sure. The question is why it's taken this long. There was a documentary before, but didn't go obviously as in depth as we did. And I'm just sort of grateful that we could do it now, really. It's just one of those times where, you know, situations fell in place and we could do it now. And I think now is a time when people are much more willing to sort of listen and to sort of understand the narratives of that time. So I think, you know, we were very fortunate in our timing, but at the same time, it took a long time to get to this point where people were willing to sort of engage in a real way.
In Southeast London would know the story quite well, but on a national level, it's not that well known. It's surprisingly not that well known for the scale of what happened. This was one of the biggest losses of life in a house fire in British history. So, so when the opportunity was there, I think we collectively just thought we have to jump on it.
Okay. Now, you both have collaborated on docs before, and I'm just curious as to why you made the decision to make this a three-part series as opposed to a traditional feature length.
Well, I think it was about what happened before the fire, what was going on before, and, you know, the political sort of landscape of Britain at that point. And then, of course, the fire, you know, focusing on the fire and the aftermath. It was, I think for us, it was always had to be three parts because we had to go into detail in all three areas. I think if you just didn't on the fire, you would have to sort of looked at the before and after anyway. But to have the time and the scale, if you will, to look at it in this way was for me, and I imagine it was obviously for James, what we wanted to do. Because again, you never know when you get the opportunity to do this again. And for me, it was all about the detail. It was all about the detail. It was all about, you know, it's two people telling you a story in a pub. One sort of bores you to tears, and one has you at the edge of your seat. So it was all about, you know, meticulously going through the story in a way to sort of lay the groundwork to understand the times and actually to have an idea of where we are now. Yeah, I'm not going to talk about my own personal journey within that, of course.
Well, I think one of the things when we were discussing it initially was that it was the anniversary of the New Cross Fire. It was also the anniversary of the Brixton Uprisings, and the Brixton Uprisings have had a lot more attention historically because of what they did locally, and then the national uprisings that followed, and so there seemed. It seemed impossible to do justice to the fire and to Brixton in a single 90. And I remember the conversation that Steve and I had. It was like, what is the biggest version of this? How do we tell it in a way that will land and resonate and be monumental? I believe the word Steve used was.
Perfect. And in terms of the
a lot of people won't know. They know about the Brixton riots, of course. You know, it's very sort of sensational. Again, splattered a lot of front pages. But the reaction was a lot, if not, a lot to do with that fire, in New Cross. I think that's what myself and James put across.
And given the people that were involved in the fire and the testimony that we heard from people that were there, what do you both feel was the motivation for the families to take part? And what do you think they got from being a part of a project like this?
I just think that we had a situation where people were willing to listen to them. I think James, the situation of being listened to. Not, a lot of people talk to people, but not a lot of people listen. And I think that's what they engaged with us, is that we wanted to hear from them what their stories was, not to frame it in any way, but for them to sort of have an empathetic ear, if you will. And I think that was it. James can say, obviously he will say what he will say after me, but it's just one of those things where, yeah, I think listening, that was it, that simple.
So we tried our hardest to reach out to everybody, and obviously we made this during COVID times, and the principle of putting the victim at the center, or the survivors in these cases at the center of their own narrative, which often doesn't happen because you often get these stories told as current affairs or history with a presenter, and so you really want to be able to frame the story in a way where the audience is listening directly to them. And it was a huge amount of work. We had an absolutely fantastic production team, and specifically Joanna Boateng, who is a producer on this, who reached out, and we tried to contact all the families. We did our absolute best to get the message out to anyone who wanted to talk, that they could come and talk to us.
Mm-hmm. One of the other things that is clearly centered in this film is racism, and I'm quite interested in sort of the multifaceted ways that you guys sort of explored it. So sometimes it's incidental, sometimes it's anecdotal, sometimes you refer to structural racism, sometimes you refer to political, sometimes personal examples. How important was it for you both for the film to be seen through that prism?
I just, I don't understand the question because, racism, again, it's like, you could park commental, put it in boxes. But it's just one of those things where, for me, it was always emotional. For me to talk to you has been a gauntlet of racism. So again, it's one of those things where, I don't want to be analytical about it, because in some ways, it's one of those things which sort of I deal with every day, have to. And I remember, New Cross Fire. I remember going to school the next day. I remember the Brixton riots. I remember going to school the next day. So it's one of those things where, one could talk about it in a formal, way, if one would like. But for me, it's film is, and how one translate that on film is about the personal. That's what it's about for me. It's about the personal and how that affects people in a personal way. And what that does, by doing that, you reach far many people than you could ever possibly think of, because you're not seeing it, you're not doing it, it's emotional. It's not sort of geometrical. And that's how I intend to focus on all the films that I do. It's never in that formal way. It can't be. It hurts too much.
I think we've got some questions from the audience.
We do have some questions from the audience. If anybody has any, the code is up on the screen. You can use that to ask some. The first question is for Steve. Your fiction films seem very immersive and experimental. Do you approach making documentaries in a different way, and if so, how?
Well, I don't. I'm making this work with James, and I think, I don't sort of, for me, what was important for me about this documentary was the detail. It was all about the detail, and I think how things are translated and presented for people's consumption, just like the sort of forensic stuff. I think it's very important that there's no ambiguity, there's no shadows cast in this situation, that everything is illuminated. So for me, that was very interesting to look at how one could present that in a way through this format. So as Goddard said, everything's fiction.
Thank you. For both, what has created the appetite to commission and fund films like this, making real and visible, obscured Black British histories?
Well, I think it's fair to say that the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matters protests after that created an immediate reaction in the documentary industry of have documentary makers been telling these stories. And obviously we had made Stephen the Murder That Changed the Nation several years before, and we'd worked with Dwayne Brooks, and we'd worked really on the coalface of trying to tell some stories that weren't commissioned. And and so as soon as there was any kind of interest, we were looking to make them. I think, and obviously Steve was just doing small acts. So.
Actually, follow up to the small acts. For Steve, you have such a range as a filmmaker, from 12 Years a Slave, Hunger, and Small Acts, and now this. What inspires you as a Black artist?
I think you should run as fast as you can before you fall down. That's my answer to that question. That's it. Run as fast as you can, as far as you can before you fall down. That's it. I think that's my answer to that question, really.
In the film makes the point that music is sort of telling the story of his life. I was just really interested to hear from you, James, how did music play a part in documenting this story?
Well, for me, I had just directed a series called 1971, The Year That Music Changed Everything, which is out now on Apple Plus, if anybody wants to watch it. Small plug. And one of the things that I had noticed on that was that if you played people music during the interview, they would have a very specific reaction to it. And so during the process, Wayne ran a sound system, and the fire happened at a party that he was playing at. So it became clear from day one that music was going to be a massive element of this. When we did the interviews, it became clearer and clearer that it was huge, because it was actually for people who didn't have photographs or snapshots. A lot of the people we spoke to didn't have any photos of themselves as children. But what they did have was memories of the records that they played and listened to, and that kind of music became a form of memory, at least, sort of in the process of making it.
I think we've got another question from the audience.
In relation to that, we have two interlinked questions. Who asked the questions during...
I think Steve's talk.
Can I say something about that? Music? No, music is the heartbeat of Black people's lives. The reason to go to bed in the morning, the reason to wake up in the morning. Because when you're sort of surrounded by an environment which is hostile, you cling on to what you can to get you through. Now, I grew up in an environment where music was everything, from calypso, soca, reggae. My mum came over to London when she was 15 years old, so it was like Small Faces, things like that. So I think you can, with Black people and music, it's not even a joke. It's the reason why. I mean, I know Aretha Franklin, for example, saved lives. Absolutely not. Bernie Spears saved lives. Bob Marley saved lives. So it's not an add-on. It is the ism of survival and living, really.
Who asked the questions during the interviews? Both Steve, James, or both? And how important was it for you to get the trust of the interviewees before filmmaking, before the film?
James asked questions.
So the way that it worked was that Steve would speak to the contributors, and and then on set I would lead the interview. But the way that we operate is what I think when you do an interview with somebody in this kind of context is that the interview needs to be agenda free, and as Steve said, it's fundamentally about listening. So you know roughly what the events that you're going to discuss are, but actually you allow them to tell you their life story. So for instance, Sandra talking about the role her dad had in her life, for Wayne wanting to fly. And in that context, anyone on set is able to ask a question so that it feels like it's an open conversation rather than driven by an individual. And the producers who had done the original reach outs would often do sections of the interview as well and talk to them, because that way it felt like everyone was participating.
Interviewing the police, because it strikes me that they go through their own sort of personal journey as they're answering, sort of realizing the reality of the situation they were in and sort of having to be objective about it now.
Well, I think the police. I mean, it's a shame not to show all 3 episodes because the police you see in episode 1, Peter Blexley and George Roden, go on a journey through the whole series, and they end in a different place somewhat to where they start. I think that in my experience of interviewing police officers is that the fact those police officers that are willing to come forward and talk and be honest about the experiences in the late 70s and early 80s, that shows a lot of courage, because there are a lot more police officers who won't talk. And so when you're actually speaking to them, it is a delicate process of them remembering things and remembering just how things were. And that is always a sensitive process.
Also, I get the impression that when you join the police, I mean, I have sympathy for the police in a way for who they are and what they do, obviously, but they go into situations, highly stressed situations. Let's say 9 to 5, more than anything else. They go into highly stressed situations. So I imagine when you leave the police, or even come towards the end, I imagine you went into therapy. I can only imagine they did. So at a certain point, when they're willing to talk, they're kind of very, they're very reflective, because it's a career option where you're going into highly stressed situations, virtually. I mean, fortunately, we hardly ever get those situations, every day. Obviously we do it now and then, but can you imagine doing that 9 to 5? So I think the therapy situation and talking to, James, and how, I think that his technique, and, it's interesting how much they sort of divulge.
That feeling of getting something off your chest, I think, is really important. And I also think that people are gratified if you really know their story and you know the complexity of the challenges that they face. And whilst obviously the series chronicles the experience that people had at the hands of the police, when you get to episode 3, you see the experience that the police officers have in the disturbances in Brixton. And it was very, I mean, we have Esther, the editor of episode 3, which, by the way, is still not quite finished, so, we'll be back at it. But it's a beautifully cut moment where you realise where some of the young kids who are throwing bricks at the police realise that the police are vulnerable and have a moment of realisation that they're not robots, that they are human beings as well. So there is a sort of a development of the journey that the police officers go on in the series is another journey.
Mm-hmm. I think we have another question from the audience.
Okay.
We have quite a few.
Who was the editor of the first film, this film we just saw, and also, you know, I think the police who talk to us were the courageous ones, because often that we're very lucky that doesn't often happen. Anyway, so I just want to say that.
Broke up a little bit on saying that the editor of 1 and 2 is Brett Irwin, who unfortunately can't be with us, but just, I mean, obviously did an extraordinary job on it.
Okay,
Yeah.
to the audience.
This is a little bit about your previous work and about a question about how uncovering these stories, doing the research, unraveling forgotten truths about the past affected both your identities. And in addition, for James, what did you learn from Stephen the murder that changed the nation that brought you to this project?
Do you wanna-
Well, I think answering the first question is, I think, again, it's one of those things where it's just a pain, really. I think you have to understand that that, you know, now certain people are listening as such, but, you know, this has been going on forever. You know, these stories are a part of any and every black person's DNA. I mean, growing up in London, hearing these stories, knowing people who knew people in the fire, it's very strange to feel that that only now people are sort of thinking about these stories, you know, in the broader, wider public. I mean, doing small acts has been kind of interesting in a way, because you know, people around the world are listening and looking and asking questions. I think the climate is a strange one right now, because I think, you know, tomorrow people might forget, people might sort of lose it. But I think that my main takeaway about this is that history's, who writes history is my main takeaway from this. Who writes history, and what remains, and what is seen, and what is hidden, and what is forgotten. So yeah, that is it really. That's what I can say about that question.
So the executive producer is also here, Salita Rogan, in the back there. She's also my wife, and our son is of mixed heritage, what do we say? Although actually, I always feel that Salita and I have very, very similar heritage for our different families that come together, and he gets taught in school about Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks and Nelson Mandela, but he has not been taught about the civil rights movement in Britain. And I think that, you know, for me, you know, at the level of identity is that when you see a story like this where there is such heroism and courage as well as, you know, tragedy and racism, you know, Paul running into that building to save his sister, you know, is an act of extraordinary everyday courage. You know, Wayne is one of the most extraordinary people I've ever come across, to be honest, in terms of the moral courage that he's still suffering from the injuries he received that night, and his whole outlook is extraordinary. I see George Ampons is here, who directed Black Power, and that was the sort of the documentary follow-on to Mangrove, which showed Althea Jones-LeCointe and Dark as How, people who had really done things to shape the freedoms that all of us enjoy together. And, you know, that point where Andy Hastings says, you know, like, I was excited, you know, multiculturalism was an exciting thing. Now, naturally, that would be what I believe, and I think one of the reasons that sometimes it's attacked is because the stories of the formation of the multicultural society we live in weren't told, and Small Axe was a tremendous step forward in that regard, and we as a company at Rogan Productions think very strongly about how to contribute to a narrative that is not just a narrative of pain and tragedy, but a narrative of heroism and sacrifice, and something that will inspire our children. As for the Stephen series, the one of the things that was always curious to me about Stephen was immediately, I mean, we had told a bit of the story of New Cross Fire in the Stephen series, and indeed the Brixton Uprisings as well, because Doreen Lawrence remembered it happening and remembered it being a shock. And Dwayne Brooks actually went as a 6-year-old on the march of the Black People's Day of Action. But the thing that was sort of most significant in terms of something that had kind of sat in my mind since I made the Stephen Lawrence series was that Imran Khan, who is this extraordinary lawyer who essentially helped the Lawrences in the early days deal with the police, he kind of came out of the blocks when he started helping Doreen and Neville, all guns blazing. He was like, you to the police, you're going to mess up this investigation, you haven't done this, you haven't done that, you haven't done the next thing. And I remember reading the letter of the SIO of that investigation back to Imran, which was a bit sort of like, hang on a second, we've only just started. And what I realized through the research was that the reason that what Imran was doing was he had learned from lots of cases before, but New Cross was a totemic case of how you have to organize and get into a place where you get the justice that you're looking for quickly, because the system, rightly or wrongly, for reasons that may be banal and some reasons that are shocking, will close down on a case, and you will get a New Cross situation where 40 years later it's unresolved, it's an open verdict, nobody really knows who did it or what happened.
I'm curious, in terms of this particular story, it's a British story, but it clearly resonates with things that people are talking about around the world. Even just the notion of Black Lives Matter is right at the heart of what drives this story, because they wanted their lives to matter and they wanted some accountability for that. I'm just curious to know what the plans are for this film internationally. Is there an international release strategy? Are you hoping to be able to share it with a wider audience outside of the UK?
Yes. Yeah, film is streaming, so it's going to have that live for hopefully other festivals, and yeah, absolutely. We're not isolated anymore. Yeah, that's answered that question. Yes, absolutely.
And I'm curious, what would you say you both learned or discovered that you didn't already know from making this film?
So do you want to answer that, Steve? Or?
You go ahead. I'm actually thinking, to be honest.
Well, I mean, again, I found the level of the fire bombings, the reports. They're very difficult to substantiate. There were lots of little reports of fire bombings, and when I say little, I mean they had little column inches. So you would see, house in Walthamstow, family of 5, 4 die, in a firebomb, and so the scale of what was happening in between 77 and 81, and then hearing people talking about seeing people burning crosses. That it wasn't the only account I heard of a burning cross. The first time somebody told me they'd seen a burning cross in Bermondsey, I didn't actually believe them, because I thought it just seemed so kind of incongruous to that moment. But then I heard a couple more, so I was really shocked by that. And what it made me think was, again, I know about the burning of churches in the South in America, and why did I not know about these firebombs? The New Cross fire aside, even after the fire, there were several more firebombs that year. They were quite significant, and they just didn't seem to be reported, and they're not part of our cultural history. And there is a question about that. That was a surprise for me, and there is an extraordinary moment at the end of episode 2 where a reporter from the time called Juliet Alexander talks about the press response. And I don't think I'm going to spoil it, but it's worth watching, because I think if anything sums up my sort of slight horror and surprise of what I learned in this, that would be it.
I think it was echoing what I said before, as far as I'm not surprised about anything, because you know, again, when you live it, when you see it, and you know, it's sort of you know, again, it's very difficult in a way to sort of articulate. And I suppose what I'm trying to say is the fact that I'm not surprised about anything. And yeah, that's the thing. I'm not surprised. But I think the only thing I could say is that I'm just very happy as filmmakers we can sort of you know, bring certain narratives to a broader, wider audience. And we'll see what happens. Because sometimes I just feel sometimes you're pissing in the wind with, you know, with these things, you know. And then you do tell the story from 40 years ago, and so what? You know, will it stick? You know, you can pat yourself on the back. Oh yeah, we did this, but does it matter? Will it matter? Will it stick? What will we gain? Will we be better people? Will things change? I don't know. But am I surprised? No. But the thing I will leave myself with an image is the whole idea of the dance, the whole idea of the blues, the whole idea of, yes, this thing happened. And what happened afterwards is so amazing. Because again, I'm speaking to you now here. I'm sorry to go around in circles, but I'll finish up very quickly. Is the fact that from that fire, it was almost like a phoenix coming from the fire, coming from the flames. So much positivity happened because of it. Yes, it was a tragic event, but you know, so many lives benefited from it, mine included. So that's the thing I would love to leave it with, really. But surprise, no surprises, no surprises.
To end on, and if anyone would like to explore the themes that are raised from Uprising elsewhere in the festival, I'd recommend George Mponza's curated selection called Black British Stories of Resistance. It's a new catalogue. Films are The Mangrove 9 and The People's Account, and they are available to watch, together with this episode of Uprising, for a very limited period only, on DocFest online platforms, Sheffield DocFest Selects for all of those in the UK, and DocPlayer for pass holders. So I'd just like to say a very big thank you to Steve McQueen and James Rogan for this special screening. And if you're wondering when the Uprising trilogy is available, it's coming to the BBC this summer.
Can I also just add a quick plug? There is a short film in the festival called Just Solly, which is a beautiful short film that is actually also about the New Cross fire, or at least has an element of the New Cross fire. And I opened the catalogue today and I saw it. And we know the filmmakers. It's really worth looking out because it's a very, very beautiful experimental short film that includes the story of the fire.
Thank you.